Welcome to our first ever history podcast. This podcast will look at important events in history and prehistory, and then we'll also discuss them and give our opinions on the impact that they had. So this is going to be a lot more formal than our media podcast. Not only will we be looking at historical events, but we'll also be looking at historical figures that shaped the world and sort of the impact that they had. So first off, I thought we could start off with introductions, just in case this is your first time viewing our podcast, or this is our first time for the history podcast, so we will just do some introductions. So my name is Xavier. I'm a third-year archaeology student at Trent University. I have taken history courses, but there's just a lot of general knowledge that I have about these topics, and then we also do research for these podcasts as well. We also have databases and access to things that provided through the university.
Yeah, we're students, so our student accounts link us up with databases and portals and whatnot.
So I'm 21 and I have field experience in archaeology, so that's sort of my field of expertise that I like to look at, and sort of prehistory. I want to be looking at underwater archaeology or history of the Americas. So the second part of the podcast is Mason.
Yeah, I'm Mason, and I'm a history major at also at Trent U with Xavier. He lived in res with me down the hall in my first year, and that's basically how we met. In terms of my historical interests, I primarily like the early modern period, specifically the wars of religion in Europe, as well as overseas expansion of England and Spain. But I've picked up a few other interests this year, such as modern Soviet history. I was in a Soviet history class, and it's awesome. And I also have been taking a lot of Canadian history courses, and I'm really into sort of the religious change in Victorianism that took place in the 20th century. But I also love everything historical, and if I didn't have to be reading 150 pages a week for my program, I'd definitely be talking a lot more and reading a lot more history. So
Alright, so how this podcast is going to work. So every other week we will post our podcast on YouTube. So one week we'll have the media podcast go out, and then the following week will be the history podcast. I know we did 2 media podcasts in a row. That's because we didn't really know how we were going to do the history podcast yet. And also there was Marvel's Daredevil and Batman vs. Superman just came out recently, which is why we wanted to just quickly cover those. So each week we're going to cover a different topic or a different person, and then try to provide an interesting storyline, but also give you the facts. So right now we're strictly just going to be audio, possibly visual in the future. We may include visual photos, but there won't be a video feed or anything like that. Yeah. We may be bringing in guests from other, maybe our classes, our friends or something, which would be cool.
Yeah,
maybe Isaac could come by one time.
That would be awesome. Yeah,
and we'll just maybe we'll host it and we can ask them questions, but we don't really know yet. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We just are going to start out with this and hopefully go along with that. So our other media podcast, just to talk about that for a little bit, is so we do movies, TV shows, video games, basically anything in the media, and then we upload that one on the other Thursday. Like I said, we did Daredevil and Batman, but this is different. So those ones are looking at our opinions and what we think is going to happen in the future, but this one is more so presenting the facts and information about the topic. So this week we really just want to establish that in the beginning, so this might be a little bit longer, but we're going to look at 1492 this week, which is the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So I also want to make the note that we can cite our sources if people are interested. So I can put links to different journals, articles, or whatever. And then if it's requested, we can also do the DOIs and stuff like that, just because we can use the databases. So it's not just all coming from Wikipedia or something.
That's a good idea. I like that.
And then also, if you guys could just share your podcast with our friends, that'd be cool. Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, whatever. That would be awesome. So we also are going to break down the podcast into different sections. So first, we're going to be looking at context and background, so we'll provide a brief history. And then second, we'll do what happened. Third is significance and implications of the event. And lastly is going to be misconceptions, and then we'll just have a few concluding statements. But this might just be for this podcast. We might like switch it up for the next history podcast. Okay, so I guess I will start with the context and background information.
Go for it.
So just in case, like I said before, what 1492 was, it was the year that Christopher Columbus sailed in hopes to find India. But instead of landing on the shores of India, he landed on the shores of the Americas. And that's, everyone else pretty much knows the rest of the story. So for the informational part of the podcast, Christopher Columbus was born into a very low rank in Italy. His father was a wool comber, which I found hilarious.
Yeah.
At first, I saw that as like a womb comber. So I had like no idea what the hell that was, but I just misread it.
Yes. Some weird medieval job.
Which wouldn't even surprise me because it's plausible.
Yeah,
so despite this, he was able to still like obtain an education. He learned to read and write at an early age, and he was specifically educated in geometry, astronomy, and navigation, which sort of relates to his like exploration into the Americas. So he was born in Genoa, Italy. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. If I pronounce anything wrong, I'm sorry. It's just that's what it looks like to me. And he proposed to the Spanish and to other people as well, to other countries as well, that if they sailed westward, they would be able to find the East Indies quicker instead of sailing like all the way around Africa or crossing across the massive continent of Asia and Europe and all of that. So he eventually received the funding from the Spanish crown because the Spanish crown wanted to get into the spice trade with Asia. They weren't like heavily involved with this trade. They wanted to enter into it more, so which is why they funded Christopher Columbus. And just a little fact: when he did reach the Americas, Christopher Columbus landed on one of the islands of current-day Bahamas.
Awesome. Alrighty. So to put this kind of in the context, like if you were to sort of put headings over like historical periods, you would find this put in the area where you would study the historiography, a big fancy word for timeline or way people look at history. It's in the same historiography of economic, political, and social expansion of empires. So you'd be looking at the period of about 1400 to about 1750. Portugal and Spain are the first countries to do this overseas. If you're not counting Italian continental exploration, which was happening as early as the 1200s, so the 13th century. The Italian explorers were Marco Polo, his family traveling to Asia Minor. But yeah, so putting this period into context, it's the overseas expansion of world powers, like old world powers in Europe.
Okay, so just to describe what happened exactly, that was like sort of like a brief little history, and now we're just going to get more into it. So Christopher Columbus actually completed 4 round trips from 1492 to 1503. The first trip had the 3 famous ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta. I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. But the third ship was the Santa Clara. And on October 12th of 1492, they landed on the shores of the Bahamas. Columbus named it San Salvador. The natives on the island were very peaceful and friendly. There wasn't confrontation right away. And also the crew noted that they had gold jewelry on them and took them prisoner. And then they also demanded to show them where the gold was from. From there, Columbus made many stops on other islands searching for gold. So he sailed north from the Bahamas up along the coast of the Americas. So it would be going from Bahamas to like Mexico up towards Florida, Louisiana, and all of those states up there. And then he would come back down, and then he would eventually sail back to Spain in 1493, and he took natives with him. But not all of the natives that he took with him survived, possibly due to illness, sickness, or maybe just murder. Who knows? So we're not going to cover the 3 other voyages to the New World because it was the first voyage that really shook the world, like, if you will.
Yeah.
So it was the most significant because this is when Europe found out that there were new lands. And then after that, there was a big rush for the resources in the New World and then trying to set up colonies in the New World. And now Mason will just go over the significance and implications of 1492.
Yeah. So the big one that a lot of historians tend to take away from this period is that this marks the emergence of the global economy, the global world, and by extension, early modern capitalism. So if you remember way back to elementary school when you learned about triangle trade between the three continents, Africa, Europe, and North America, this is the period that starts that. The interconnectedness of several different continents across the world starts in this period. It's also significant for the fact that the old world empires begin to lose their power. This is especially towards the end of the period when the Atlantic world bears witness to a number of different wars. So Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, who are like sort of the big three at the beginning of this period, they start to lose their power, and that paves the way for new world powers to start to assert their economic and military dominance. So towards the end of the 18th century, you start to see continental powers like England and France growing in not only their economic might but their military might, and to an extent America too. If you take the early modern period as far as the American Revolution, it obviously America becomes sovereign from England. But it's important also because of new techniques of persuasion that start to arise in this period. I had a professor who actually argued that Columbus's letters of 1492, which he writes to Queen Isabella and the King of Spain when he returns, are actually early modern forms of propaganda, which is interesting because in these letters he is embellishing fact so that he can get profit or more funding for like future voyages. It's definitely different from the propaganda that you would study, say, in Nazi Germany or World War I America. But yeah. Also, leading from this, travel writing becomes a huge phenomenon in the period due to the effectiveness of Columbus's political writings. I had a class this semester that required me to read some of these travel writings from England. Obviously, I don't speak other or read other languages, but these writings were interesting. There's a lot of subtext in them. So, for example, people visiting the New World would tend to brag about the plantations. But in reality, they were secretly calls for help because of how terrible the conditions on the plantations were. So this new kind of skill emerges, this politically skillful writing that has subtext underneath it, that is a call for help, but on the outset looks like a brag. Also, this is huge, and trying to cover this would be like trying to put like a bikini on an elephant, because you can't definitely cover this in any way, but slavery as an institution emerges as an economic necessity. So the beginning of the slave trade starts in this period, not long after Columbus lands in America.
Wow, yeah, like a lot of my points was what I was going to say. I never like read your points, what you were going to say, so I just kind of threw mine together. But mine, you kind of covered mine. But I also just wanted to point out that sure. So Columbus's letters, you said, were like propaganda. Yeah. So also when in archaeology, there's this gentleman named Marshall Salins, and then he was the one who sort of created the noble savage. I hope I'm getting that right, because that'd be really embarrassing if it's not.
No, yeah.
But so the noble savage was because they found all these hunter-gatherers, these foragers, and then they saw them as pure. So that's what they wrote back to Europe to get people to come over to colonize the Americas. So that's also just want to point that out. I don't really have anything else other than that because
I'm a point stealer.
Went over. Well, I never read your points.
Oh, okay.
So I just mine basically were like, yeah, the exploration period was like sparked. There was like a new public perception of the world.
Yes.
So which was big because they thought the world was much smaller, but then they realized that the world wasn't. And then I know you're also going to get into this, but like the world was no longer flat.
Right.
Which is also very interesting too. So
yeah.
Like you said, like there's the colonization, and then there's the fur trade, which was very big. And then the pelts, the fur trade and the pelts, like they were seen as a luxury item.
Yeah.
So they could be worn for comfort, but also showed status. And then also many countries were trying to extract those resources from the Americas back to Europe.
It's funny because when the Europeans would get involved in indigenous economies, the indigenous would simply barter. Like, they would just trade. They didn't have paper money,
Yeah.
which was also recently introduced in Europe. But, like, imagine getting involved in an economy where your money is worthless and you're trying to give it to people who are trying to give you, like, beads and feathers and stuff. No, but yeah, I think that this period definitely creates a need for this new kind of writing and this new kind of convincing, because, like, as beautiful and as profitable Columbus's landing in the Americas was, he had a great deal of convincing to do in order to get more funding and in order to even convince people that this is a profitable endeavor. So his letters in 1492 and his correspondence starts this whole movement where people need to kind of double speak, to kind of use 1984. Like, they have to double speak in their writings. So,
and then also, like, the most noticeable impact is definitely that there's English speakers in Canada now.
Yes.
There's English speakers in America, and then South America, Central America is just flooded with Spanish speakers or French, Portuguese. Right? There's just so many languages there. But that's all because of Columbus coming over. And then spreading colonization. And now we're just going to look at some misconceptions.
Okay. All right. So the number one misconception that you've probably come across most frequently is the whole, the world's flat and we're not going to fund Columbus because he thinks it's round. That's actually not true. Western science had determined that the Earth was spherical. The only confusion at the time of Columbus was that the Earth was at the center of the universe, which Copernicus would correct with his heliocentric revolution. So European science had actually proved that the Earth was round. No one, especially in the church, the Catholic Church or the higher-ups, actually still believed it was flat. The mistake that they most commonly made was that the Earth was at the center of the universe and not the sun. So stemming from that, Columbus's initial voyages pre-1492 were actually denied for a number of reasons. He asked Portugal first, but they were killing it overseas. They had already established ports, not colonies, but ports, and they didn't really see the need to spend money on this person promising to do essentially what they'd already accomplished. Also, Portuguese navigators and mathematicians believed Columbus's math to be wrong. They believed that he undershot the total travel distance by, like, a long shot. And this is something he would go on to be told later in Spain as well. But I guess the question then becomes, how did he get the permission and the funding for his voyage? Some scholars have argued, and I definitely agree with this, that a major part of answering is understanding that Spain at the time was at war with the Muslim population, and they'd actually just secured control of the homeland from the Muslim attackers, and they needed to strengthen Christianity both at home and abroad. And I think that they saw Columbus as the potential person to do this. I think as a Catholic and someone who was driven enough to go overseas, I think they saw a real opportunity for him to spread Christianity to the New World, kind of start fresh. A second misconception is that the Indians got their names because Columbus thought that he landed in India. This is only partially true. I don't think that this misconception gives much credit, rather, to the intelligence of Columbus and his navigators. Because truth be told, he knew that he wasn't in India, but he didn't know where he was. He just knew that he wasn't in India. So that led to him needing to designate this indigenous populations as something familiar. And so he referred to them as Indians in his letters of 1492, and from there it just kind of caught on. So yeah, in its summary, the world was never flat. It was round. It was just at the center of the universe. And he knew they weren't Indians, but he called them that anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I just had one little misconception. So it's widely believed that Columbus was the first person ever to reach the Americas and discover it, but that's not true. So there's actually the Vikings preceded Columbus's arrival. The Vikings were led by Leif Erikson. I don't know how, like, it's Leif. If you know how to pronounce that, that'd be cool. But that actually happened in the 11th century, and Columbus didn't come to the New World until the 15th century, and it was actually very late in the 15th century. However, the Vikings didn't continue to have a long-lasting contact with the natives. Like, there was a little bit of trade, but they didn't continue to come over, and there wasn't a set colony. There are in Newfoundland, there's in Canada, there are There's like little
Really?
settlements there that are like underground, sort of. But also, okay, so this is kind of groundbreaking because in archaeology, I get a lot of these news stories and then I hear them from my professors as well. But what they think they found, I think it's Newfoundland. It might be in Labrador, or it might be it's one of the maritime countries though. It's either Quebec, like really eastern Quebec, Labrador, or Newfoundland, or maybe even New Brunswick. I can't remember, but it's one of them. But what they think they found was actually a Roman sword.
Ooh.
Like Roman soldier sword. So they think that it's possible that Romans got there first.
Interesting.
Or what they think is that Vikings who were in conflict with the Romans acquired their weapons, and then when they came to the New World, then they just happened to leave one behind. But it's really strange to have like a Roman sword.
Yeah, no,
Which would be which raises like a ton of different questions.
It does. That reminds me of a book I read last summer. It was called 1492. It's by Gavin Menzies. It's one of the best sellers, or it was last year rather. So, if you keep up with recent books and whatnot, you've probably heard of it. But in 1492, he actually argues that the Chinese treasure fleets made it to America 50 years before Columbus.
Oh, I read. Yeah, there was that too.
Yeah. He actually not America. It was the Polynesian Islands and South Argentina. Apparently, there's evidence there.
China, the Asian populations, right?
That China made it there first. Yeah, and I don't know. I know the book was criticized. I read it last summer, and I can't remember any specifics, but that's another.
I remember that too.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's also really interesting. But if it's if they are Romans, then the Romans would be there first, which would be absolutely crazy.
Yeah, that would.
So just to conclude, overall, we both feel that Columbus's expeditions were very important to the future of the world, and his pursuit to travel to India over the Atlantic Ocean was influential and forever changed the world. Also, one last note, Mason and I find our information independently, which is why I never read his notes.
Right.
And then we share it here, so that's basically how we go through it now. We don't know how we're going to do this in the future, but we're hoping, obviously we're going to try to do the next one better, and the next one after that even better. Again, we're trying to keep it under 30 minutes or around that mark, which is good because we're not going over this time.
Of course.
And we appreciate you listening. So
yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks.